Okay, Lynn, the next question comes from the American Studies Division of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And he says, Dear Mr. LaRouche, I would be very pleased to hear your views on the so-called group of two. This is the idea being promoted by Fred Bergston, which says that the Chinese and the US economies are so closely interdependent that they are one economy. And this G2 is the dominant economy in the world. The G2 idea is also being used to put pressure on China to take more so-called responsibility in the current financial system. However, Chinese Prime Minister Wen has said several times, including to President Obama, that there is no such G2, that China has a long way to go to become a developed nation, and wants to keep its independent policy for international cooperation with many other nations. What is your view?
China, in my view, is a civilized nation at the time that Europe is not, especially the British. I don't know who's going to teach who the lesson. And what China and Russia did, I was in the area of this discussion as this approached. I was very much for it. At the time when I was in Rhodes, and we had much discussion of this with some relevant people there. And we had people from India and other parts of the world who were also there, who were involved in this discussion. And I was very optimistic on China's coming up with a treaty agreement of this type. I thought, from my discussions with people who represent China here and so forth, that my conclusion was that they understood their problem very well. And it was a matter of a production problem. China had been used as a cheap labor market and allowed to have certain industries generously, but not allowed to have the technology it needed. China was cut off for various reasons from access to certain technologies which China should have. And that was a problem. And that is one of the things we're trying to fix now. So it was obvious to me that this kind of change should be made. And I was optimistic because my estimation of what China had manifested is its own understanding of its problem, that if the Russians would make a certain kind of approach, that China would probably accept it. And so when I talked to the Russians and others there in Rhodes, I assured them that my belief was that China would make such an agreement. And it did make such an agreement. And therefore, I'm rather enthusiastic about the fact that it worked out. But the problem is, China needs you need a protection of a fixed exchange system type of protection. And now that we have the agreement between China and Russia, what is really needed is the United States to quickly embrace that treaty agreement, that kind of treaty agreement, and join it. And to make it work, you must bring India in. However, I know that if Russia, China, and the United States agree on this, India will be in. Because India's problem is the British problem on this. So if the three countries, and the important thing is not the order in which these things occur, though that's significant. The point is a commitment from leading circles in the United States to bring about a four-power agreement of that type comparable to what was struck between Russia and China in this recent agreement between the presidents and the state and the government, will force the Indians will come along. We also have all other kinds of problems, including this idiocy in Afghanistan. We have to break that. The Afghanistan problem is a British problem. The British are running a drug operation in Afghanistan. Everything is being run. The military operation is a drug operation. And this Dubai thing was a key to it. We have to break the British Empire. And since and you know, England will survive nicely. A lot of people in England would be happy to get rid of the empire because there's sexual proclivities for other things. But we need this kind of agreement because in that area, strategic area alone, we got an idiot who wants to put troops there I thought McChrystal was bad enough, but this thing from Obama is beyond belief. It's insane. We've got to break it. We've got to get it out of there. Because we know what the problems are. Well, for example, let me suggest something to you. You ever hear of Osama bin Laden? Do you know what part of Pakistan he's living in now? Do you know why he's never been caught? Certain British and Saudi and Americans are protecting him. That's why. But he's not the guilty party. The guilty party was the BAE, the British BAE, together with the Saudi influences, which financed that operation called 9/11. And a lot of our people would like to have certain forces go in there and take them out, bring them back to expose what they really are and clear up this mess of what really happened in 9/11. Not the usual nonsense, but this is still there. It's a British-Saudi operation. 9/11, an orchestration of an operation against the United States with complicity of certain elements associated with government, political elements, international elements associated with government. That's the kind of thing we have to deal with. So why not? So therefore, what you have to understand is the Afghanistan operation, like many organized wars, which engaged the United States, especially since the Kennedy assassination, were operations against us, the United States, by the British. The British have wanted to destroy us, and they've done a damn good job of doing it by getting us involved in silly wars. What about Indochina? Why did we get into that thing? MacArthur said no, and he was right. Kennedy said no, he was right. You don't need to have these kinds of wars, so-called revenge wars or special operations war. You don't need them. We destroyed our military. I mean, we had a case of our friends in Germany when I was working on this SDI prospect. And we had a lot of German military, senior ones, who were working with us, as well as others, on the idea of trying to avoid, to deal with the disintegration of the Soviet Union at that time, to deal with it in a way by simply going to this SDI proposal as an alternative, because the Russians were disintegrating. We knew it. And therefore, why not make this kind of agreement to develop a system which eliminates this nuclear warfare system and use that as a way of getting some economic cooperation and development? And of course, we had some of the people in the CIA leadership and the national security operations generally, and in the presidency itself at that time, who accepted my proposal as a project and tested it out. And the president agreed to it in January of that year. So we know this kind of area, and we know it was against it. We had Brits who were for it also. But the British monarchy, the British Foreign Office was against it. You should take the names of the people who were living then. Major general officers, senior or the outstanding veterans of the German military establishment at that time, the leaders of the French military establishment, the Italians, serious consideration of cooperation from the government of India, because Indira Gandhi was still alive then. We had the ability to create the kind of arrangement which Roosevelt had intended. The cards were in our hands. I gave an address on the 12th of October in 1988, which I laid out exactly this situation. It was in our hands. Now you had skunks inside the Soviet system, like Gorbachev, and people like that, but it made a complication. Andropov was also a big problem in this matter, a major problem. But what we're dealing with the thing where you think of war as some kind of an institution all by itself. When you look at the history of warfare in Western civilization since the Peloponnesian War, you realize that warfare is often not an act of courage, but of desperation and folly. Because people use wars, as the Roman Empire did. To control the empire, they would use wars between peoples within the empire and play them against one another in order to win. You should read this in Machiavelli, for example, which is supposed to be the basic military education for a lot of people. Read it. The use of war as an enterprise in folly. You don't start from trying to win wars, you start to trying to run the world. You try to orchestrate events which lead to an event which should be desired by all parties. Peace is the objective. Peace is by the definition of history. Since the Peloponnesian War, Greece was a leading culture of that period, together with the Egyptian culture, the leading culture. Greece was about to, in a sense, to defeat the Persian Empire, which is the greatest empire of that period, and the most repressive. They did. But then what they did is they turned around, and Athens made war on Corinth, Corinth made war on Athens, and then they both made war against Syracuse. And out of this, the culture of Greece is still around, but it has never been the same since. So war is more often a case of folly than of courage. And that's the way we have to look at this thing. We have to understand that our objective is to bring the relations among the sovereign peoples of the planet into cooperative order. Sometimes military force is necessary to check something that needs to be checked. But the idea of a long war, unless you're forced to fight it, is the greatest folly I can imagine, at least from my knowledge of history. And what happened to us, what really happened to us when you see the 9/11 thing, you see that. What happened? When did I say we're going to have a 9/11? I didn't call it 9/11. I said in the beginning of January that year that we had to expect a major terrorist operation inside the United States used for the purpose of installing the authority of the George W. Bush administration. We were looking all over the place we had an operation in Northern Virginia and around Washington, very serious. We had this little event in Italy. Suddenly we had this thing in New York. I knew immediately what it was. It was what I knew was going to happen. Somebody on the British side with something complicity inside the United States was going to pull a stunt like this, because you had a totally incompetent, intolerable president, George W. Bush Jr., a piece of crap. How did this thing ever slide into the presidency? So how do the British do things like that? And it's the British that do that. It kind of interests the Wall Street crowd and so forth. Why do they do that? Because the crisis was on. The situation was, by current standards at the time, uncontrollable. The Clinton administration, with all its weaknesses at part, especially after the indictment, the impeachment indictment, was weak. But nonetheless, we had made certain progress under Clinton, who was a two-term president. Now, that's a very significant institutional fact. A two-term president tends to have a great influence on what follows his two terms. And we had a great crisis, the great swindle of this, the financial swindle was pulled out of the Bush and Company, was now dead. We had a collapse of the great bundle. And I knew that they were going to pull a crisis. And it had to be an act of terrorism, either war or terrorism. And we got the terrorism. And I know that the evidence exists that the BAE and certain high-level Saudi influences ran part of the operation, and therefore probably all of it. It was run to ensure and install a relative dictatorship on behalf of the George W. Bush administration. To some people, that's a shocking thing to say. To me, it's not. Because that's the way I read history. That's what happened to us. And then we got this president as a result of the George W. Bush administration. But we have also in the presidency and institutions, we have people who have an understanding of this, though most people don't have the temperament to bring it out publicly as I do. But it's known to other people. My job is to say the unsayable, especially when it's necessary. And they're afraid to shoot me because they might get credit for it. It's my best protection. But anyway, this is the case. It's the fact. And that's what we have to understand in this particular case, that we're dealing with that kind of problem.